So, we are finishing up this series today, and we have looked at various movements in the life of Joseph in the Old Testament book of Genesis. And I've said that it's a message of forgiveness as we see him as a favored son that is sold into slavery. He goes into Egypt, and it is there as he enters Egypt that he is bought by a man named Potiphar, who is high-ranking individual in Pharaoh's court. And he has such skill that he rises to the level of being a supervisor over Potiphar's house. And he does that for 9 years. And one day, Mrs. Potiphar comes on to him and entices him. We're not really sure what her full motivation is in that, but Joseph resists and she screams, and others in Pharaoh's service come running into the room, and she accuses Joseph of raping her, and he finds himself in prison. And it is there in prison that he becomes sort of like a supervisor. Again, his skills shine through, and there are two of Pharaoh's officials, a baker and a cupbearer, that are in prison, and they have dreams. And these dreams are talking something about their future, and Joseph, as a dream interpreter, tells them, this is what your end is, and one is restored to his position while the other is executed. Joseph asks the cupbearer on his way out to be restored to his position to remember him. And of course, the cupbearer doesn't. He forgets about Joseph, and Joseph is left in prison until Pharaoh has a dream of his own. And the dreams are about the future of his own reign, that there would be 7 years of plenty and that there would be 7 years of famine. And at this point in our story, we are in the famine years. Joseph does something very important during that first 7 years. He saves up all the grain he could to prepare for the coming time of famine. But as we saw last week, there's kind of a shady side to Joseph in the sense that he is an individual that takes all the money, all the livestock, and even allows people to sell themselves into servitude to Pharaoh in exchange for food. Meanwhile, Jacob and his sons go into a time of starvation, and Jacob says, I hear there's a man down in Egypt that will sell us grain. And so he sends his sons down to Egypt to buy grain. And they do so. And as they come back, they live the next year having plenty of food. And then their food runs out. And it's time to go down a second time and to buy more food. But one thing that Joseph did when he was seeing his brothers for the first time is he said, you have a younger brother, the youngest brother, that's still back home. And the next time you come down, you bring Benjamin with you. Benjamin, the son of my right hand, Jacob's new favored son, because it was the second son of his favored wife, Rachel. And that's where we stand right now. Joseph is a sovereign. He has power that is over everyone in the kingdom except Pharaoh himself. And so when we come to the story of Joseph, we see this intermixing of different components. We see him being abused when he's sold into slavery. We see that there are power differentials. Now Joseph has risen to a position of power, and he could get even with his brothers if he wanted to. He could send them all to death if he wanted to. But what we see is forgiveness and wisdom coming out of this power differential, and that's where we are as we close the story of Joseph. Here is a man now who's 40 years old. He's been serving Pharaoh for a number of years, and what we find is that he has to move beyond the hurt and the pain and the desire for revenge. And as he does so, he will come into reunion with his brothers. Writer Frederick Buechner has said this about forgiveness in his book, Wishful Thinking. When somebody you've wronged forgives you, you're spared the dull and self-diminishing throb of a guilty conscience. When you forgive someone who has wronged you, you are spared the dismal corrosion of bitterness and wounded pride. For both parties, forgiveness means the freedom again to be at peace inside their own skins and to be glad in each other's presence. Boy, that's a great way of summarizing the last chapter of Joseph's account in Genesis. Somehow he comes to a place where he's able to forgive his brothers, to be at peace with where he has been over the course of the last 20 years of his life, and to keep this perspective that sometimes it's through pain that God works providentially. Now, this is the hardest lesson I think we'll ever learn in life. We desire to avoid pain. And when we are hurt, we desire some type of payback. We desire some type of retribution. No, we might not do so physically. We might not be vigilante about it. But deep inside of us, we hope that the other person fails. We hope that the other person will experience some type of hurt in the same capacity that we experienced it. So in the closing chapters of Genesis, what we have taking place is a couple of trips back to Egypt, and we have Joseph testing his brothers. He wonders, have my brothers changed at all? Are they still the same self-centered group of people that I grew up with? Are they still the ones that are only looking out for themselves? Are they the ones that are jealous? Are they the ones that would have loved the multicolored robe? Only I was the one that had it, and I was the one that was given dreams. And so Joseph has a lot to contemplate here. And Jacob, meanwhile, back home, is just trying to keep the family fed. He is trying to prevent burying his sons and his wives and grandchildren from this severe famine. He's watched already some of his neighbors have to bury some of their loved ones because the text tells us the famine was severe. And it wasn't going to let up anytime soon. 2 years into this thing, and yet there's 5 more years where there's a shortage of resources. And so Jacob says, go back. Go back and buy some more grain. He wants to hold Benjamin back. He can't let go of this new favored son of his. This son of the love of his life that he worked 14 years to obtain to marry. He served his father-in-law Laban 14 years for the right to marry Rachel. And now this son is the epitome, the trophy of his love. And yet Joseph insists, doesn't he, that his full brother, Benjamin, come back to Egypt with his other half-brothers. 22 years has passed since Joseph was sold into slavery. And I'm sure over those 22 years, Joseph had many moments of self-reflection. Those times where he thought about what had happened to him. He could have blamed God. He could have blamed his dad. But mostly he could have blamed his brothers. He would have thought it unfair. He would have thought it unjust. And it was. The balance of power, though, has now shifted. No longer is he a slave. And now, in power, he has the ability to control the life of his entire family. What is he going to do with that power? So Jacob sends his boys down, and they don't know what's going to happen when they get there. They're full of fear and anxiety. Is Joseph going to make us pay? Is he going to take out the pound of flesh that he rightly deserves to give to us because of the way we treated him? The brothers have not recognized Joseph at this point. Joseph recognizes them, but Joseph now looks like an Egyptian. He has on royal garb, and he has rings and silver and gold and servants and a headdress and everything that could masquerade his appearance. When the boys get down there, they don't recognize him. These men have no idea who this second in command is. All they know is that he seems a little bit harsh. He seems a little bit demanding. When they go back home with the grain, there's going to be some episodes that happen that is quite threatening to them. Now, I did not read this. This is in an earlier chapter. In chapter 42, Joseph is going to put them through a series of 3 tests. And these tests are to see whether they are changed individuals. Test number 1 is when they arrive in Egypt, he's going to accuse them of being spies. Now, this espionage, this moment in time, have you come to learn of our secrets? Have you come to try to figure out a way of stealing our resources? So he's going to begin the process. And the process is simple. You're arrested. And he throws all of them into prison. Now, what's fascinating about it is he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep all of you in prison, and one person could go back to your father Jacob. And he can take back the grain to the family. And then in a moment's notice, in chapter 42, Joseph changes his mind, which is fascinating. Within 3 days, the text tells us, chapter 42, and here's another theme that you find in Scripture. The third day is always the day of change. The third day is the day of resurrection. The third day is the day of hope. The third day is when Joseph comes down into the prison. He says, I've changed my mind. You can all go home except one. Now, he's going to have to see who's going to do this. Who's going to step up to the plate? Who's going to be willing to stay behind? And one of them, named Simeon, chooses to do so. And so he sends them off. As he sends them off, he reminds them that if you come back again, you got to bring that younger brother, Benjamin. Test number 2 is who's going to stay back? Simeon volunteers. The rest are on their way. They've been accused of spying, and they have been tested as to see who is willing to be self-sacrificial in staying behind. Along the way, they stop. And they open up the bags to look at the grain, and all the silver, all the money that they had brought down to Egypt to buy this grain is sitting there on top of the grain. Now, this sends electric shock waves through their system. Oh my God. what happened here. We're not only being accused of being spies, but now we can be accused of being thieves. We took the grain, but we stole the silver. And what we find is they are individuals that when they get back home, they're going to have to explain all this to Dad. We had to leave another of your son behind. Simeon is down there in Egypt. And we have the silver that we took down. That would have been an interesting conversation. We're not let in on the full conversation between Jacob and his sons here. Fast forward, a whole year passes. They run out of grain. And they're to go down again, but this time they have to take Benjamin. Joseph's story is so long in text that we don't have time to look at all those chapters, but there is a lot of debate going on. Jacob says, I'm going to die. You're going to send me to my grave if I have to send Benjamin to Egypt. And the brother said, no brother, no grain. We don't have a choice. If we don't take Benjamin, he will not sell us any more grain. And Jacob hems and haws around, and he finally looks at his family, and they're getting a little lean through the face. They've lost weight. They have not had enough to eat. And he finally says, okay, take Benjamin. And Judah says to his dad, I will be the personal guarantor that I will bring Benjamin back home to you. So they make this trip in chapter 43 back to Egypt, and they bring Benjamin along. Benjamin comes into the presence of Joseph. Joseph has never seen Benjamin. And Joseph is overwhelmed with emotion. Here is his full brother. He serves his brothers an incredible meal in this chapter. And we're told that he places 5 times as much on Benjamin's plate. Shows favor to him. And then he sends them on their way. The brothers bring back the silver and said, we don't know how this was in our sack when we were traveling home. And Joseph says, no, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that at all. Sends them back home. But this time, as they travel back home, Benjamin traveling back to his dad, Joseph takes one of the precious vessels, the silver chalice that represents royalty, and puts it in Benjamin's sack. And as they travel on, he then sends an entourage to catch up to them. And they're kind of pulled over like a police car pulls over a speeder and open the trunk, please. They begin searching through all the grain, and in Benjamin's sack is this silver chalice. And the brothers are just pale with fear. What's going to happen to Benjamin now? Now, it could have been real easy for those brothers to betray Benjamin just like they had betrayed Joseph, right? They could have looked out for their own skin. They don't leave him behind. So they go back in front of Joseph and they plead. Please allow Benjamin to go back to his dad. Please, please, please. And Judah speaks up and says, I'll stay behind. Simeon and Judah. Both were willing to sacrifice themselves. And in that moment, where Judah offers himself to be a slave for the rest of his life to Joseph, it's in that moment that Joseph makes himself known. And that's the part that I read to you. Joseph, in that sacred moment of time, chooses to forgive his brothers. Amazing, really. It's beyond the majority of people's ability to do that. You see, most of us, when we have been wronged, we want to set up an amortization table, a payback. We do not want punishment all at once. We want it extended over a period of time. And we insist on them feeling it the rest of their lives. But Joseph has worked through a lot of stuff in his soul. And I don't know when the light bulb turned on, but it did. He begins to see the bigger picture. That God was still involved even in these terrible moments of his life. And that, in fact, if these things had not happened to him, it's quite possible that Jacob and his brothers would have died. He's a ruthless business guy. He's like most individuals that Pharaoh is demanding a maximum amount of profit. And so Joseph does some shady things to make sure there's enough grain for 7 years. He enslaves a lot of people in the process. But remember this, a person cannot be defined by one phase of their life. A person cannot be defined by one moment of their life or one mistake in their life or one slip of wisdom where they use foolishness instead of perspective. Joseph, for all he is, spoiled son, a bit arrogant, a bit braggadocious, powering up over his brothers through his own dreams, becoming a powerful vice regent and controlling all the money and all the land, yet has this moment where he has a choice. Is he going to set up that amortization table where he's going to force his brothers to pay it out the rest of their life? Or is he going to choose to forgive? To forgive is not to forget. Joseph will remember those years, just like we will all remember those years when we have been hurt. But will it force our hand to make dumb choices of extending that hurt out over the course of the rest of our lives? Maybe what we need to understand is that forgiveness is reflected in this moment when the pain is so palpable. Joseph breaks down and he cries and he sends everybody out of his presence. And he's heard weeping. Here's a man that is sort of like the ultimate general, tough guy that's able to march forward. But in that moment, he withers because of all that has happened in his life and all the moment that is represented in this second. Will I forgive? Or will I force them to pay again and again and again? And it's reflected right here in this beautiful statement. Come near me. Isn't that cool? Come near me. Takes off his headdress, takes off his robe. He looks into the eyes of his brothers and says, I am Joseph. I am Joseph. This moment is so profound because he chooses to forgive them. And then he says something real strange. He's basically letting them off the hook by saying, you did not send me here, but God did. Forgive yourself too. And you know that real forgiveness has taken place when you not just withhold punishment, but you grant permission to allow people to forgive themselves. What they did to Joseph was terrible. But he chooses to allow them to forgive themselves and to be able to move on in their lives. You know, life is too short to carry pain all the way through it. I love when there are certain songs that summarize the things that we have been talking about. You know, life is hard and forgiveness is near impossible at times. And yet, as much as we would love to exact revenge, the greatest victim in not granting forgiveness is us. When we grant forgiveness, we get forgiveness. I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and sometimes when there's a song that pops into my mind as I write these messages, I sometimes think about those moments when I was a teenager, those moments when I was a young man, just like Joseph. There was a song that many of you might know. Carly Simon once sang this song, "I Haven't Got Time for the Pain." She sings, "Suffering was the only thing that made me feel I was alive. Thought that's just how much it costs to survive in this world. But you showed me how to fill my heart with love, how to open up and drink in all that white light pouring down from the heavens." Quite unsure who Carly Simon is singing about there. But what if we recognize that sometimes God allows suffering in our lives, and sometimes we endure it, but most often it is the heart of the matter to be able to forgive in any situation. Maybe we can put this in perspective when she sings, "You showed me how to fill my heart with love, how to open up and drink in all that white light pouring down from the heavens." What if that is one of the missions of God? To allow us to drink in the white light of God's love, to drink in the white light of God's forgiveness in our own lives, to drink in the white light of His compassion and His mercy and His grace in the midst of the prisons that are found in the course of life. What if, in those moments, we recognize that in God's eyes, every brother and every sister in the human race is loved to the core? And what if we could forgive as Joseph gave his brothers? Would it make this world better? Would it make this place safer? Now, let me finish the story of Joseph real quick. So we're not going to extend this series anymore. But finally, Jacob will come down, and he will be reunited with Joseph. He will travel to Egypt, and he will be able to rest his head when he dies, being able to see the son that he thought he lost. And so it's a great way to finish the book of Genesis, because at the end of Genesis then, Joseph, who has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, The story then bridges into the book of Exodus, and there's how the nation of Israel, this small little tribal group, becomes a great nation when they're in Egypt for 400 years. So the end really is kind of a bridge to the beginning of a new nation, okay? May the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you. May he lift up his countenance upon you. May he give you his peace. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving full of good times with your family and good food and just Lord's blessings upon each of you until we see you next week. God bless you.